The chipped ceramic warmed her hands, the chamomile tea doing little to thaw the chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. It wasn't tea, the cold of Cold Creek Hollow, though the November air had a teeth, chattering bite, but something deeper, a persistent unease. Ellie traced the rim of the mug, watching steam curl and dissipate against the window pane. Outside, the skeletal branches of birches clawed at a gray sky. This was her view now, deliberately chosen, meticulously planned. 6 months. 6 months since she'd become Ellie Finch, retired librarian, seeker of quiet. 6 months since she'd traded tailored suits and a city skyline for flannel shirts and endless acres of Montana wilderness. 6 months of calibrating her accent, softening her gaze, practicing the slow, deliberate movements of a woman with nothing to hide. She perfected the routine. 7:15 a.m., strong coffee. 8 a.m., volunteer at the Hollow Creek Library, mostly shelving books and pretending to enjoy the local book club's enthusiasm for historical romance. 12:30 p.m., a solitary lunch of soup and a sandwich at the diner, careful to order the same thing each time, to be predictably unremarkable. Afternoons were for long walks, always on different trails, mapping the area, not for pleasure, but in case she needed to know the land tonight, like most nights. She'd finish a crossword, read a book, something deliberately bland, and be in bed by 9, rinse and repeat. It was a life designed for invisibility. Old man Tiber, the diner owner, waved from behind the counter as she entered for her lunch. Afternoon, Eleanor usual, please. Tiber, she offered a small, practiced smile. He was a kindly man, too curious for her comfort, but harmless. Dee told him a story about escaping a stressful job in Chicago, a tale of grief and the need for peace. Dee bought it, readily people Troy wanted. To believe in simple stories. Halfway through her tomato soup, the diner door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and a gust of anxious energy. Sheriff Brody, a man built like a granite monument, with eyes that missed nothing, strode in and settled onto a stool. "Bad news, Tiber," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Hank Miller, Seth's gone missing." The diner went silent. Hank Miller was, well, Hank was Simvin Hank. Everyone knew Hank, a ranch hand at the Barstone Spread, a jovial giant who could fix anything and always had a story. He'd been helping old man Hemlock with his winterizing before the blizzard hit. "Blizzard got him, most likely," Brody continued, shaking his head. "He knew the risks, told Hemlock he'd finish up, wanted the extra cash. Now," he trailed off. "Search party, going out in the morning, weather permitting." "Poor Hank," Tiber murmured, shaking his head. "He was a good boy." Ellie forced herself to look sympathetic, to offer the appropriate expression of concern. She didn't know Hank Miller, didn't want to. Involvement was a risk. She learned that lesson the hard way. But as she ate, Brody's words echoed in her mind. "Fee gone missing." Asterisk, it was a phrase that scraped at something buried deep within her. The faces started to flicker at the edges of her vision. A sterile interrogation room. A defendant's steely gaze. A photograph of a young woman, smiling, vibrant, vanished without a trace. Sarah Jenkins. The case that had shattered her career, her life, and forced her into this elaborate performance. She hadn't thought of Sarah in months, not consciously. The memory suppression techniques were remarkably effective. But the mention of a disappearance, the sense of something amiss, had cracked the carefully constructed facade of her new life. The snow continued to fall, thickening the silence outside. After finishing her soup, Ellie retreated to her small cabin, the memory of Sarah clinging to her like the damp chill from the storm. She tried to lose herself in a book, a cozy mystery with a predictable plot. But the words blurred on the page. Her hands trembled. The scent of chamomile, meant to soothe, felt cloying, suffocating. Images flashed. Sarah's parents, their faces etched with despair. The unsettling feeling of Sunidhi knowing her killer was walking free. The threats that had followed, escalating until the marshals had offered her a choice: disappear or become another statistic. She got up and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling white landscape. The trees, heavy with snow, loomed like ghostly figures. She needed to walk. She needed to feel the cold to ground herself in the present. Bundling up in layers, she ventured out into the deepening twilight. The snow crunched under her boots, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. She followed a path she'd taken dozens of times. A loop through the woods behind her cabin. It was near the old Hemlock Ranch boundary that she saw it. A stand of aspen trees, their white bark stark against the dark forest, and carved into the trunk of one of them. A symbol, a circle bisected by a downward pointing arrow. Ellie stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. The blood drained from her face. It wasn't just a random carving. She knew that symbol. She'd seen it before. It was the calling card of Daniel Hayes, the man who killed Sarah Jenkins. He carved it into surfaces near the bodies of his victims. A twisted signature, a perverse claim of ownership. He was supposed to be in prison, locked away for life. But here it was, a ghostly echo of a nightmare she thought she'd escaped, etched into the bark of a tree in the quiet solitude of Cold Creek Hollow. She reached out a gloved hand to touch the carving, a tremor running through her. The snow fell faster, obscuring her vision. As a terrifying realization dawned, she hadn't run far enough, and whatever brought her here, whatever peace she sought, was about to be shattered. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind her. She whipped around, heart hammering against her ribs, but saw nothing. Just the swirling snow and the silent, watchful trees. Perhaps it was an animal, or just the wind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and that the quiet she'd so carefully cultivated was about to be filled with something terrifying. A small, folded piece of paper lay at the base of the tree, half buried in the snow. It hadn't been there moments ago. She knelt, her fingers numb with cold, and carefully unfolded it. A single word was written on the paper, in stark black ink Thwinsoon asterisk. The word Suntun felt branded onto her retina. She folded the note, carefully tucking it into a waterproof pocket inside her jacket. The symbol, the note, it wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Daniel Hayes was supposed to be incarcerated in a maximum security prison in Nevada. Yet, the echoes of his twisted signature reverberated here, in the heart of Montana. Sleep was impossible. She spent the rest of the night poring over news reports about Hank Miller's disappearance, downloaded from the patchy library internet. The local paper offered little beyond the basics: age, occupation, last known whereabouts. No mention of any enemies, no history of recklessness, just a hard-working ranch hand swallowed by a blizzard. But Ellie saw patterns where others saw misfortune. Blizzard conditions were common in Cold Creek Hollow. Experienced ranchers knew how to survive them. Hank Miller wasn't a reckless man. The absence of any logical explanation felt deliberate. She revisited the details of the Sarah Jenkins case, meticulously reviewing photographs, witness statements. The psychological profile she'd painstakingly constructed of Daniel Hayes. Hayes didn't act impulsively. He was a planner, a manipulator. He enjoyed the control, the psychological torment. He left a signature seen by not just the symbol, but subtle arrangements. Carefully chosen objects. Ellie focused on the area around the aspen tree. The snow had partially melted, revealing disturbed earth beneath the carved symbol. Someone had been there recently. She took photographs, documenting everything, her movements precise, economical, old habits died hard. Her retirement hobby of hiking had given her ample opportunity to observe the locals. She focused on Tiber, listening for gossip, and surreptitiously watched Sheriff Brody interact with townspeople. The diner was a font of information, albeit often colored by speculation. It was there she first heard the name Silas Blackwood. "Old man Blackwood," Tiber said, wiping down the counter. "Lives up on Blackwood Ridge, reclusive fella. Doesn't take kindly to visitors. Folks say he is peculiar." "Peculiar how?" Ellie asked, carefully gauging his reaction. "Oh, keeps to himself. Stories about strange rituals, things like that. Just small-town talk, mostly. But he finda one odd one." Blackwood, the name pricked at her. The Blackwood estate was vast, bordering the Hemlock Ranch, perfect for concealing someone or something. She spent the next day browsing at the library, subtly questioning Mrs. Gable, the town historian, about the Blackwood family. They've been here for generations, Mrs. Gable said, adjusting her spectacles. Original homesteaders, wealthy but very private. Silas is the last of the line. Lost his wife a few years back. Never really recovered, they say. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Brody found her sketching the Blackwood estate from a distance, a harmless pastime she'd adopted to appreciate the scenery. He approached, his expression unreadable. Enjoying the view, Eleanor. It is beautiful country, she replied, making sure her voice sounded light, untroubled. Brody leaned against a weathered fence post, his gaze unwavering. You've been asking around about Hank Miller. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. Just making conversation small towns are. Friendly. Yes, and private. Folks here don't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses into things. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Especially folks with city habits. I was just curious, she said, keeping her tone even. I read about Mr. Miller in the paper. It is a tragedy. It is a blizzard, Brody said gruffly. Tragedies happen. We'll find him when the weather breaks. But I advise you, Eleanor, don't go looking for trouble. This isn't Chicago. We handle things our own way here. She knew she was walking a dangerous line. Brody wasn't openly hostile. But his warning was clear. Stay out of it. Blend in, remain invisible. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The symbol, the note, the unnerving familiarity. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. That evening, the diner was hushed, the usual chatter replaced by a palpable sense of fear. Another person had vanished. Sarah Jenkins, a waitress at the diner, hadn't shown up for her shift, and she hadn't been seen since leaving work the previous night. Tiber was beside himself. Sweet Sarah, she wouldn't just disappear. She was saving up for nursing school, A good girl, that one. He wiped his eyes with a stained apron. Ellie felt a cold dread wash over her. 2 disappearances within a week during a blizzard. It wasn't just a coincidence. She returned to the library, ostensibly to return some books, but her real purpose was to access the police database. Her old connections hadn't entirely vanished. A discreet phone call, a favor owed, and she had access to the preliminary reports on both cases. The details were sparse. No signs of forced entry at either victim's home, no witnesses, no obvious motive. But one detail stood out, a minuscule piece of evidence that sent a shiver down her spine. Both Hank Miller and Sarah Jenkins were found with a single unusual object clutched in their hands. An antique button. It was made of intricately carved bone, depicting a stylized raven. Ellie recognized it instantly. She'd seen that button before. Not in a photograph. Not in a case file. She'd seen it on Daniel Hayes. He'd worn a vintage jacket adorned with similar buttons, trophies collected from his victims. She raced back to her cabin, her mind reeling. The button, it couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was recreating Hayes' signature, taunting her, drawing her into a deadly game. She searched her own belongings, her hands shaking. Had she been followed? Had she inadvertently brought something Thudioin, or someone Thudi with her to Cold Creek Hollow? Then she remembered the antique shop in town, dusty memories she'd visited a few weeks ago. Browsing the curiosities, trying to establish a rapport with the owner, Old Man Hemlock, she'd even admired a display of antique buttons. She grabbed her coat, ignoring the howling wind. She had to go back. She had to know where that button came from. The quiet of Cold Creek Hollow had been shattered, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the echoes of the past were about to drown her. The chipped porcelain of her mug felt cold against her lips. Chamomile tasted like ash. Sleep remained a luxury she couldn't. Tita Ford, the image of that raven button pulsed behind her eyelids, a dark omen. Silas Blackwood, the name resonated with a growing sense of foreboding. The library yielded little beyond genealogical records and faded newspaper clippings. The Blackwoods had arrived in Cold Creek Hollow in the late 1800s, establishing a vast ranch and amassing considerable wealth. But the historical accounts were strangely sparse, glossing over details, punctuated by whispers of eccentricity and self-imposed isolation. Old Man Tiber had mentioned rituals. Mrs. Gable at the Historical Society had alluded to peculiar traditions. Ellie needed more. The Hollow Creek Historical Society was a small, ramshackle building, more of a storage facility for forgotten relics than a proper archive. Mrs. Gable, a frail woman with an encyclopedic memory, was the sole caretaker. After some carefully crafted small talk, Ellie learned that the Blackwood family had, for years, actively discouraged any detailed examination of their history. They donated generously to the society, of course, Mrs. Gable said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, but they stipulated that certain boxes, certain Fundi archives, were to be kept separate restricted access. She indicated a dusty corner of the basement, concealed behind a towering stack of antique furniture. Silas himself locked it up after his mother passed, said it contained family matters best left undisturbed. Ellie volunteered to help organize the basement, a task Mrs. Gable gratefully accepted. It took hours. Shifting furniture, unearthing forgotten treasures. Finally, she located the restricted section separate a small, windowless room, secured by a heavy padlock. I don't have a key, Mrs. Gable admitted, wringing her hands. Silas keeps it himself, but she paused. Digging into her apron pocket, I believe I have a spare, an old one. It might work. The lock clicked open with a groan. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Boxes overflowed with brittle documents, yellowed photographs, and strange artifacts. Ellie began meticulously sifting through the contents, her methodical approach honed by years of investigative work. Diaries detailed unsettling family traditions, fall solstice celebrations, involving bonfires and elaborate costumes, whispered accounts of communing with nature, a deep-seated obsession with ravens. There were letters hinting at financial troubles, land disputes, and a long-running feud with a neighboring family. The Blackwoods had always been outsiders, even in this remote corner of Montana. She discovered a family tree painstakingly drawn on parchment. Names and dates filled the branches, but several entries were marked with black ink, crossed out, as if deliberately erased from history. She noticed a recurring symbol sui, a stylized raven, similar to the one on the antique button. It appeared on family crests in illuminated manuscripts, even sketched onto the margins of letters. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows inside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rustling of aged paper. Back in town, she continued her discreet inquiries. At the post office, she overheard two women discussing Silas Blackwood. They say he talks to the ravens, one whispered. Says they re-messengers from his ancestors. My grandpappy always said the Blackwoods practiced. Things old magic, things best left alone. Old man Hemlock lost a prize bowl a few years back, found it, arranged. Like some kind of offering. He swore it was Blackwood's doing. Fear hung in the air like the scent of wood smoke. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a recluse. He was a source of dread as she left the general store. A large figure blocked her path. Jeb, a hulking man with a weathered face and cold, assessing eyes. He was one of Blackwood's ranch hands, his loyalty absolute. You were asking around about Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice a low growl. Ellie straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze. I am just a new resident, curious about the local history. Some things are best left undisturbed, Jeb said, stepping closer. Mr. Blackwood values his privacy. He doesn't appreciate folks poking their noses into his business. I haven't done anything wrong, Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Ignorance is bliss, Mama, and consider yourself warned. Stay away from Blackwood Ridge. Stay away from anything to do with the Blackwood family for your own good. He paused, his eyes lingering on her face. This town has a long memory and Mr. Blackwood has a long reach. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. Ellie stood there, frozen, realizing she underestimated the depth of the Blackwood's influence. Back at the Historical Society, the light was fading. She decided to take one last look through the Blackwood archives. She stumbled upon a small leather-bound photo album. Opening it carefully, she flipped through images of stern-faced men and women in Victorian attire. Then, a photograph fell out. It was faded and creased, but the image was clear. It showed a young Silas Blackwood, perhaps in his early 20s, standing beside a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Samuel Kerrigan, the lead investigator on the Sarah Jenkins case, the man who had been her mentor, her confidante, and ultimately, the man who had betrayed her, leaking information to Hayes, attorney. the man she hadn't seen or heard from since she entered witness protection. Her breath hitched in her throat as she studied the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. The same angular features, the same intense gaze, the same subtle curve to the lips. How could this be? What connection did Samuel Kerrigan have to the Blackwood family? And, more importantly, why hadn't he ever mentioned it? The photograph slipped from her trembling fingers, landing on the dusty floor. The echoes of the past weren't just reverberating, they were closing in. And Ellie knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was caught in a web far more intricate and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The photograph of Silas Blackwood and Samuel Kerrigan burned itself into her memory. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Samuel had always been meticulous, compartmentalized. He rarely spoke of his past, dismissing inquiries with a vague wave of his hand and a change of subject. Now, the carefully constructed narrative of her mentor was crumbling. She returned to her cabin, the weight of her suppressed memories pressing down on her. She brewed another pot of chamomile, the scent offering little comfort. She needed to think, to untangle the threads of this increasingly twisted puzzle. Then it came a fragmented image surfacing from the depth of her mind. A detail from the Sarah Jenkins case she, consciously buried, deemed irrelevant at the time. Seemingly insignificant detail about the victim's grandfather. He'd been a collector antiques, specifically antique buttons. Sarah's grandfather had owned a vast collection, meticulously cataloged and displayed in a locked cabinet. There had been rumors of a rare, intricately carved bone button depicting a raven, a button that had mysteriously gone missing shortly before his death. The connection slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The symbol wasn't just a signature. It was a marker, a signifier. And the buttons weren't random trophies. They were offerings. Silas Blackwood wasn't just recreating Daniel Hayes' crimes. He was simply continuing a pattern, a ritualistic cycle of violence stretching back generations. The diaries in the Historical Society had hinted at strange traditions, ancient beliefs. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was a warped, inherited ideology. She frantically reread the Blackwood family history, searching for confirmation. She found it hidden within a genealogy chart she'd previously dismissed, a repeated name appearing every few generations, Corvus. Latin for raven, and beneath each name a notation, keeper of the tradition. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a landowner. He was the latest in a line of self-proclaimed custodians of a terrifying legacy. She had to warn Sheriff Brody. She raced to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding. "Sheriff, you need to listen to me," she said, bypassing the usual pleasantries. "Silas Blackwood is involved in the disappearances. It is not a blizzard, it is—" Brody held up a hand, cutting her off. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern, but you are letting your imagination run wild." "It is not my imagination." She laid out her evidence: the symbol, the button, the connection to Kerrigan, the historical records. Brody listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "You've been digging around where you shouldn't have, Eleanor," he said, his voice colder than she ever heard it. "You best stop now." He then revealed a photograph tucked into his badge pocket, the same photo of Silas Blackwood and Samuel Kerrigan. "Mr. Blackwood knows things, Eleanor," Brody said, his gaze unwavering. "Things about a lot of people, things that could ruin lives, including mine." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Brody wasn't an obstacle. He was compromised. He was part of it. She fled the sheriff's office. Knowing she was on her own, she needed to gather evidence, to find something concrete that she could take to the authorities, to anyone who would listen. But she was running out of time. A text message pinged on her phone. An unknown number asterisk. "Enjoying your research, Eleanor. I admire your tenacity, but some doors are best left unopened. Meet me at the old barn on Blackwood Ridge alone. 8 p.m., or things will get unpleasant." It was a trap, of course. But she had no choice. She had to face Silas Blackwood. She had to understand what he wanted. The barn loomed against the night sky, a decaying skeleton of weathered wood. The wind howled through the broken windows, creating an eerie, mournful sound. She parked her car a distance away, approaching on foot, her hand gripping the small concealed knife she carried. The barn was empty, save for Silas Blackwood. He stood in the center of the vast space, silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the gaps in the roof. He was older than she imagined, his face etched with lines of fanaticism and regret. "Welcome, Eleanor," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I've been expecting you. Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want?" Silas smiled, a chilling, unsettling expression. "You wouldn't understand. It is a legacy. A duty. My family has been cleansing this land for generations, removing the impurities, ensuring the balance. Cleansing. You are kidnapping people." "Sacrifices," he corrected. "Necessary sacrifices. The land demands it." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "And you, Eleanor, are part of that necessity." He took a step closer. "Do you know why I chose you, Eleanor? Why I orchestrated your arrival in Cold Creek Hollow?" She shook her head, fear constricting her throat. "Samuel told me all about you," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He admired your dedication, your intelligence. But he also warned me about your interference. He knew you'd de-investigate. He knew you'd de-uncover the truth." He paused, his eyes glittering in the darkness. "Samuel was my protege, my apprentice, and you were his obsession. He confided in me about the Jenkins case, about the guilt, about the fear. And about Samuel, he knew. He knew everything," Silas confirmed. "He knew about your past, about the things you've done, about the secrets you've buried. He told me you were the perfect catalyst, the one person who could reignite the tradition." He stepped even closer, his breath warm on her face. "You see, Eleanor, you weren't brought here to escape your past. You were brought here to fulfill it." He raised his hand, revealing a small bone button engraved with a raven. "It is time to complete the cycle. It is time to become part of the legacy." And behind him, emerging from the shadows, came Jeb and two other men, their faces grim, their intentions clear. Ellie realized she hadn't walked into a trap. She walked into a ritual, and she was the intended sacrifice. The weight of silence descended, thicker than the dust motes, dancing in the moonlight filtering through the barn rafters. Silas's revelation 20 that she'd been deliberately drawn to Cold Creek Hollow resonated with a sickening finality. She hadn't been running from her past. She'd been running free toward Elle. "You manipulated me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not manipulated," Silas corrected, his voice smooth as silk. "Guided. You were always meant to come here, to understand your purpose." He gestured with his hand, and Jeb and the other men moved forward, blocking the exits. Ellie knew she couldn't overpower them all, not head-on. She needed to use her skills, her understanding of the twisted mind that held her captive. She focused on Silas, observing his body language, searching for tells. He was a fanatic, driven by an ideology. But beneath the fervor, she sensed a fragile ego, a desperate need for validation. He wanted her to understand, to acknowledge the legitimacy of his twisted beliefs. "What is this tradition?" she asked, deliberately adopting a neutral tone. "What does it accomplish?" Silas's eyes lit up. He launched into a rambling monologue about the land, about ancient spirits, about the need to purge the impurities that threaten to corrupt the natural order. He spoke of a lineage of keepers, entrusted with the sacred duty of maintaining the balance. Ellie let him talk, analyzing his words, cataloging his patterns. His obsession wasn't about the victims. It was about the ritual corti, the carefully orchestrated sequence of events, the symbolic significance of the offerings. The feeling of control. She used his monologue to map the barn, identifying potential escape routes, weak points in the structure. It was a gamble, feigning interest to buy herself time. Flashbacks assaulted her, shards of memory slicing through the present. The interrogation room. The sterile smell of disinfectant. Sarah Jenkins's mother, her face crumpled with grief. Samuel Kerrigan leaning in, offering a sympathetic smile that now felt like a betrayal. The details of the Jenkins case flooded back. Sarah's last known location. A secluded antique shop. The missing button. And the unsettling similarity between Hayes's victims. Sundaride shared vulnerability, a hidden trauma. Hayes hadn't been choosing his victims randomly. He'd been targeting women who carried a certain emptiness, a void he sought to fill with his perverse control. And now, Silas was doing the same. As Silas continued his tirade, she noticed a subtle detail: Sudi, a ventilation shaft hidden high in the barn wall, obscured by shadows. It was a long shot, but it was her only chance. She shifted her weight, subtly angling her body toward the shaft, testing the guard's awareness. Jeb, predictably, remained focused on her, his gaze unwavering. The others were less attentive, their eyes drifting. She launched her move, a swift kick to Jeb's knee, a disarming maneuver she'd learned during her training. He stumbled back, momentarily stunned. In that instant, she broke free, sprinting toward the ventilation shaft. One of the other men reacted, lunging for her. She ducked under his grasp, using his momentum against him, sending him crashing into a stack of hay bales. Then she scrambled up the wall, reaching for the shaft. It was tighter than she'd anticipated, claustrophobic. But she squeezed through, crawling through the dusty darkness, following the ventilation system away from the barn. The shaft opened into a hidden basement beneath the main house. The air was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and earth, and the sound of muffled cries led her to a set of heavy steel doors. Behind them, she found them: Hank Miller, Sarah Jenkins, and another young woman she hadn't heard about. All huddled together in a makeshift holding cell. They were shaken, frightened, but alive. "It is okay," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "I'm going to get you out of here." Working quickly, she managed to unlock the cells, freeing the captives. They stumbled out, weak and disoriented. She led them through a labyrinth of underground tunnels, guiding them toward a hidden exit she'd spotted on a hastily sketched map in the Historical Society archives. But as they neared the exit, a voice echoed through the tunnels. "Impressive, Eleanor. I underestimated your resourcefulness." Silas Blackwood stood at the end of the corridor, blocking their path. He held a lantern in his hand, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. "You thought you could escape," he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You were wrong. This isn't about saving them. It is about fulfilling the prophecy." He gestured toward the captives. "They're already chosen. Their fate is sealed." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "And yours is to witness it." Then he delivered the final chilling twist. "You weren't sent here by the marshals, Eleanor. You were sent here by him, Samuel Kerrigan. He knew the tradition. He understood its power. He wanted to see if you, his brilliant Prachugai, could break it, or if you would succumb to it, just like he did." He smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. "He knew you'd come looking for me. He knew you'd be the key. You were always meant to be part of the legacy. You are, after all, my granddaughter." "My granddaughter?" The words echoed in the claustrophobic tunnel, a grotesque distortion of everything she thought she knew. Samuel Kerrigan, her mentor, her betrayer, connected to this monster by blood. It was a lineage of darkness, stretching back generations. Silas's revelation wasn't designed to shock. It was designed to break her, to force her to confront the unsettling possibility that she wasn't a victim of circumstance, but an inheritor of a terrifying legacy. She didn't flinch. Years of suppressing trauma, of building walls around her emotions, had hardened her. She wouldn't let him win. Not now, not ever. "That is absurd," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You're trying to manipulate me." "Am I?" Silas chuckled, raising the lantern. "Look at the family portraits. Eleanor, the resemblance is unmistakable. My sister, Elizabeth, she had your eyes, your mother. She abandoned me, just like your father abandoned you." He was attempting to sow doubt, to exploit the voids in her past, to draw her into his warped worldview. She wouldn't let him. "You're a killer," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "A predator who hides behind twisted ideology." She glanced at Hank, Sarah, and the other woman, huddled together, their faces pale with fear. She had to protect them. She had to end this. Silas lunged, swinging the lantern. She sidestepped, the glass shattering against the tunnel wall, plunging them into near darkness. The ensuing fight was brutal, chaotic. Silas was stronger, fueled by fanaticism and decades of pent-up rage. But Ellie was faster, more precise. her movements honed by years of self-defense training. She used the tunnel's narrow confines to her advantage, leveraging her agility, targeting his pressure points. He swung wildly, but she anticipated his moves, weaving around his attacks, landing calculated strikes. She focused on his ego, needling him with questions about his failures, about his inability to maintain control. She reminded him of the empty promises he'd made to his ancestors, of the cyclical nature of his violence. "You're not a keeper," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're a coward hiding behind tradition." Her words struck a nerve. His attacks became more desperate, less focused. He was unraveling. She used the opportunity to disarm him, snatching a rusty pipe he'd been wielding as a weapon. She didn't strike to kill. She didn't want to become a mirror image of him. Instead, she used the pipe to block his attacks, to create distance. But Silas was relentless. He tackled her, sending them both crashing to the ground. They wrestled, grappling for control, their bodies bumping against the cold, damp walls. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the tunnel. "Sheriff Brody, freeze." "Drop the weapon." The sound startled Silas, momentarily breaking his concentration. Ellie seized the opportunity, pushing him away with all her strength. He stumbled back, sprawling against the wall. Brody, looking grim and determined, stood at the entrance to the tunnel, his gun drawn. He'd finally broken free from Silas's control. "It is over." "Blackwood," Brody said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest." Two deputies appeared behind him, securing the entrance. They quickly secured Silas, handcuffing him and leading him away. Ellie stumbled to her feet, her body aching, her clothes torn. She checked on the captives, ensuring they were unharmed. They were shaken, but alive. As the deputies led Silas away, he turned to Ellie, his eyes filled with a chilling intensity. "You haven't won, Eleanor. The tradition, it will endure." She didn't respond. She knew he was wrong. The cycle was broken. The aftermath was a blur of activity. Medical personnel arrived to tend to the captives. Investigators swarmed the ranch, meticulously documenting the evidence. The FBI arrived to take over the investigation and debrief her. Ellie answered their questions, providing a detailed account of everything that had happened. She revealed her true identity, her past life, her reasons for going into hiding. The agents listened in stunned silence. In the days that followed, Silas's network of influence began to unravel. Corrupt officials were exposed. Hidden assets were seized. The full extent of his crimes was revealed. The weight of her past settled upon her, heavier than ever before. She was no longer Eleanor Finch, the quiet librarian. She was Ellie Kerrigan, a former agent with a dangerous history. The FBI offered her a chance to return, to rejoin their ranks, to use her skills to help others. But the thought of returning to that life filled her with dread. The constant surveillance, the relentless pressure, the ever-present threat. She'd spent years trying to escape that world. She'd found a semblance of peace in Cold Creek Hollow, a fragile tranquility she wasn't sure she was willing to sacrifice. But could she truly remain hidden? Could she continue to live a lie? She stood on the porch of her cabin, watching the sun rise over the Montana landscape. The sky was a canvas of vibrant colors, promising a new day. The chill in the air was gone, replaced by a faint warmth. She knew she couldn't simply vanish. She couldn't ignore the fact that she had a unique skill set, a responsibility to use it. But she also knew she couldn't return to her old life. She made a decision. She would stay in Cold Creek Hollow. She would rebuild her life. But this time, she would do it on her own terms. She would become a consultant, offering her expertise to local law enforcement agencies, helping them solve difficult cases. It wouldn't be easy. She would always be looking over her shoulder, aware of the shadows lurking in the periphery. And she knew that her past would always be a part of her, a constant reminder of the darkness she'd faced. But she would embrace it. She would use it to fuel her work, to protect others from suffering the same fate. The quiet had been broken, shattered by violence and revelation. But from the ashes of the past, a new beginning had emerged. And Ellie Kerrigan was ready to face it, no longer hiding, but finally truly free.